Imagine, just for a second, two radically different spaces. First, picture this modern apartment in Amsterdam.
Okay.
The walls of the hallway are completely lined with this, like, high-tech, translucent gray polymer that remembers every single physical touch you make. Like if you brush your shoulder against the doorframe, it remembers.
Right.
Now, hold that image and picture a completely different world. A cold, drafty room in a 400-year-old former monastery.
What a contrast.
Yeah, and inside, a woman spends 13 months doing almost nothing but staring at a jagged crack in the plaster wall and keeping a perfectly empty, cream-colored notebook.
I mean, it sounds like the setup to a surreal art film, right?
Yeah.
But these two spaces actually form the core of the incredible source material we're looking at today.
Yeah, it's this dual-text experimental novel by authors Max and Claude.
Exactly. It's titled The Inventory of Touching and the Unmaking Room.
And it is such a strange, beautiful reading experience. You're essentially reading two interlaced stories.
Right. Intertwined.
Yeah. One is credited to the pseudonym Marshall Hale Skill, which tracks the scientist in Amsterdam. The other is by Orga Unextended, following the woman in the monastery.
And the whole thing is capped off by this meta-analytical post-matter section at the end that, attempts to tie everything together.
Which is exactly what we are going to do today. The mission for our deep dive is to explore the profound connective tissue between these two very different lives.
Right. We're really looking at the concept of the gap. The spaces, the failures, the absences that pop up in our daily lives.
Because what the sources are ultimately arguing is that these broken connections, these blank spaces we usually try to fix or just, ignore, might actually be the most vital parts of our relationship.
Yeah, our memories, our very existence, really.
So, to you listening to this right now, if you've ever felt frustrated by a miscommunication or felt like a piece of your own history was missing, this exploration is going to completely reframe how you look at those empty spaces.
Oh, absolutely. It really challenges our default assumption that a perfect, unbroken connection is, always the goal.
Right.
But to understand why perfection might actually be a trap, we kind of need to start in that high-tech Amsterdam apartment.
With Maren.
Yes, Maren. She's a 38-year-old materials scientist, and she actually developed this polymer composite herself in a lab in Eindhoven.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the defining feature of this material is that it's embedded with 11,000 piezoelectric sensors per square meter.
Okay, let's unpack that term for a second because I definitely had to look it up. Piezoelectric sensors essentially take physical pressure, the push of a hand, and convert that mechanical stress into an electrical charge.
Exactly.
So when you push on the wall generates this tiny electrical signal to record the event.
Right, and it's 11,000 times per square meter. I mean, it is an incredibly dense, highly sensitive network. Every single bit of pressure leaves a permanent digital record.
That's a lot of data.
It is. Over the course of 18 months, Maren's walls have logged roughly 14,000 of these contact events.
Gee.
But there is a massive catch to the system. The wall doesn't interpret any of the data.
Right. It doesn't know what it's feeling.
Exactly. It just registers the pressure, the duration, and the location. It doesn't know that it's Maren leaning against the hallway. It just knows a mass of a certain weight applied force for 4 seconds.
And while her walls are doing all this passive, unfeeling recording, Maren herself is doing the analog version of the exact same thing.
She really is.
She keeps this meticulous, handwritten inventory of every single object she touches in a day. We're talking the most mundane, invisible things in your house.
Right, her toothbrush.
Yes, her Oral-B electric toothbrush, and specifically the one that glows red because she always pushes too hard. The coffee mug with a faded department logo.
She even logs that she lifted her phone exactly 47 right hands today. It's so specific.
It's obsessive, but we have to look at the psychological root of this obsession.
Right. Why did she start doing this 11 years ago?
Yeah.
It actually began when her mother, who was suffering from severe dementia, stopped recognizing Maren.
God, that is just a devastating moment for anyone to go through.
It really is. And it fundamentally broke Maren's understanding of reality. For her, the profound trauma wasn't the physical death of her mother, which happened years later.
It was that specific moment.
Yes, the moment of unrecognition. Maren just became obsessed with the boundary between a person and an object.
And what's crazy is she concludes that the difference isn't about biological essence or having a heartbeat.
Right. It's entirely about recognition. It's about whether something turns toward you when you enter a room.
That is such a haunting definition of humanity.
Mm.
And it really makes that high-tech polymer wall feel incredibly tragic to me.
How so?
Well, think about it. You have this hyper-advanced smart home setup essentially tracking every physical movement with perfect precision. But if a system just records that a body pressed against it with 1.2 newtons of force and it doesn't know it's you, isn't that deeply lonely? I mean, it's a witness without empathy. Maren essentially built a technological replica of her mother's dementia.
Wow. Yeah, she surrounded herself with a material that can feel her but can't know her. And Maren eventually realizes this in her notes.
She calls it one-directional gift, right?
Exactly. It takes the physical heat of her forehead resting against the plaster, but it doesn't give anything back. It captures the physics of the moment perfectly, but it entirely misses the meaning.
So we have this central problem established. A perfect physical record without any emotional connection is essentially useless.
Right.
But then the source text takes us into her laboratory to look at a failure in this material.
Yeah.
Everything kind of flips.
It does. We meet sample 4C. This is a piece of Maren's polymer that has a critical defect.
The delamination.
Yes, it's suffered what materials scientists call a delamination. Basically, the adhesive layers holding the sensors together have separated. They've pulled apart, creating this microscopic gap, a tiny void right in the middle of the solid material.
And Maren decides to test this gap. She presses on the top layer of the sample with an enormous amount of force, like 11.7 newtons of pressure.
Which is a lot for a tiny sensor.
Right. But because of that microscopic void in the middle, the sensors below the gap barely register anything. They only pick up a faint 0.4 newtons.
It's a massive 96.6% loss of signal across this microscopic void. I mean, in any traditional engineering sense, a sample 4C is garbage. It is a completely failed material.
But then Dan enters the picture.
Ah, yes.
Dan is a 43-year-old colleague of Maren's, and his specialty is media archaeology. His office is described as this museum of obsolete technology.
Yeah, he has an 1892 telegraph key that he taps on while he thinks. Old Minitel terminals from France, Apple Newtons from the 90s.
And when Maren brings him this massively failed piece of polymer, Dan doesn't see it as a defect. He sees it as the purest definition of mediation.
Exactly.
Wait, here's where I really have to push back on Dan's logic.
Okay, go for it.
If you, listening to this, have ever been stuck on a Zoom call where the audio keeps dropping out, or you're trying to stream a movie on hotel Wi-Fi and it just keeps buffering, you know how infuriating signal loss is?
Oh, for sure, it's the worst.
Right. So in a modern world where we are constantly chasing perfect 4K video, zero latency, gigabit fiber optic internet, why on earth is this guy excited about a 96% loss of signal?
Well, what's fascinating here is if we connect down excitement to the broader picture of media theory, his argument makes perfect counterintuitive sense.
Okay.
Down argues that a transmission with absolutely zero loss wouldn't be a medium at all. It would be identical duplication. It would just be a mirror.
I see.
Think about the difference between getting a perfectly crisp text message from a friend that says happy birthday versus finding a faded, water-stained, handwritten letter from that same friend in a drawer.
Yeah, the text is perfect, but the letter has more weight.
Exactly. Because the degradation, that gap, the fading ink, the time it took to travel is exactly what makes a medium a medium.
It requires you to do some work.
Yes, the receiver has to interpret the messy handwriting. The friction is what makes it a memory, rather than just a data clone. Dan points out that all his old machines, the telegraphs and the pagers, are designed specifically to transmit across a gap, and they all lose something in the process.
That loss is the signature of distance.
Beautifully put, yes.
Wait, so if the 11.7 newtons is the perfect text message, the 0.4 newtons is the messy, faded letter that actually makes it into your hands.
You've got it. And that framework triggers a massive realization for Maren regarding her mother's illness.
Oh, I see where this is going. The dementia is the delamination.
Exactly. Maren realizes that even deep into the final stages of the disease, her mother's hands still knew how to fold laundry.
Wow.
The relational memory, the part of the brain that knew it was Maren's laundry, the part that could recognize her daughter's face, that was gone. But the motor memory persisted.
That pure muscle memory of folding a shirt was the 0.4 newtons of signal that survived the massive delamination of her brain tissue.
It was heavily degraded, stripped of all its emotional context and history. But it was a signal that successfully crossed the gap.
It wasn't perfect 4K recognition, but it was enough to prove that a piece of her mother was still transmitting.
Right.
That is just incredibly moving. And once the text establishes how powerful a broken physical connection can be, it completely shifts
It
gears.
does a complete 180.
Yeah, we move away from the measurable scientific gaps in Amsterdam, and we dive into the unmeasurable spiritual gaps in Cold Stone.
Which brings us to the second half of the dual text, the story titled The Unmaking Room.
Right.
Here we meet Hessa. She is a former theologian who has recently moved into a vacant 400-year-old former monastery.
And her daily routine is the absolute inverse of Maren's,
Complete.
where Maren is obsessively cataloging every single physical touch. Hessa is cultivating absence. For 13 straight months, she sits in what used to be the prior's cell.
Doing basically nothing.
Yeah, she keeps a cream-colored notebook on her desk, but she leaves it completely empty. She refuses to write a single word.
And her only real physical action is this daily ritual where she takes her finger and traces a 2-meter-long jagged crack in the plaster wall of her room.
She is engaging in a literal daily ritual of touching brokenness.
It seems bizarre on the surface, but the text introduces her friend Yale to help frame what Hessa is actually doing.
Yale is the mathematician, right?
Yes. Yale calls Hessa every Thursday. And during one of these calls, Yale brings up a complex mathematical concept called persistent homology.
Okay, persistent homology. When I was reading this section, I tried to map this out in my head.
Let's hear it.
I thought of it like a donut. If you take a camera and zoom in way too close on a donut, all you see is a wall of fried dough.
Right.
If you zoom out way too far, it just looks like a tiny brown dot.
Yeah.
But the hole in the middle, that hole persists no matter what scale you are looking at. So the absence in the center is the defining feature. Wait, actually, zooming out makes the hole disappear too.
Yeah, it kind of falls apart there.
That analogy doesn't entirely hold up for explaining the persistence, does it?
Well, mathematical topology is notoriously tricky to visualize. The donut gets you halfway there, but let me offer the physical object Yale actually gives to Hessa in the text to explain this.
Okay, please.
She sends Hessa a 19th century glass fishing float. It's one of those beautiful sealed glass spheres that fishermen use to keep their nets buoyant.
Oh yeah, I've seen those in antique shops. They're totally hollow.
Exactly. That hollowness is the point. The only reason that sphere functions as a float is because it contains a trapped, persistent bubble of air from the 1860s.
Oh, that.
The glass shell is just the container. The nothing inside the something is the active ingredient. The void is the tool.
Because if you fill the glass with solid material, it sinks.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
absence is the only thing keeping it afloat.
Then nothing makes it work.
Yeah.
Okay, that clarifies it perfectly. The persistent feature isn't the glass, it's the empty space it protects.
Right. And, imparting this purely as the philosophical exploration presented in the text, Hessa takes this mathematical idea of persistent homology and applies it directly to her theology.
Interesting.
She has been sitting in this monastery, feeling spiritually empty, assuming her faith had vanished. But the fishing flirt changes her perspective. She realizes she hasn't lost her faith. She is just staring at a God-shaped hole.
So, tracing the crack in the wall every morning isn't her dwelling on the destruction of the building.
No, it is her maintaining the shape of the absence. She realizes that an empty space, like her empty notebook, or the profound silence in the stone room, when it is maintained through rigorous daily practice, is a powerful, persistent feature.
It is not a failure of her belief system.
Exactly. The emptiness is the shape of the devotion itself.
That totally reframes the very idea of a crisis of faith. What feels like a gap is actually the structure.
Yeah.
But the authors don't let this remain a purely intellectual or theological exercise, do they? The concepts of gaps and filters stop being just about math and monastery walls, and they become intimately physically human.
They do. They bring the defect directly into the human body. Yale, the mathematician who explained all of this, suddenly develops a severe heart arrhythmia. Yeah. The electrical signal that naturally tells her heart to beat hits a literal biological delamination in her cardiac tissue.
Like the polymer wall.
Exactly like it. The electrical current can't go straight through the muscle like it's supposed to, so it is forced to take a longer, erratic detour. The rhythm becomes totally regular, but the blood still manages to pump.
And at almost the exact same time in the narrative, down in the basement of Hessa's monastery, a plumber named Greet is called in to fix the heating.
Right, the boiler issue.
Yeah, she cuts open a massively clogged boiler pipe. Inside, they find 37 years of mineral deposits. There are these thick concentric rings of calcium and iron that have choked the flow of water down to a tiny, struggling trickle.
And Hesse looks at this ruined, calcified pipe and poetically calls it a scripture written by water.
See, I really struggled with this part of the book.
Really? Why?
Well, treating a serious cardiac arrhythmia or a destroyed heating system like beautiful architectural features feels dangerous. It feels like we are wildly romanticizing a medical crisis.
I can see that.
Yale could die from that heartbeat. A failing heart is failing. A clogged pipe is broken. Why is the text trying to make failure sound so poetic?
Well, it's interesting because the authors actually address that exact tension through Yale's cardiologist.
Oh, right.
The doctor looks at her charts and explains that her heart isn't failing to beat. It is actively solving the biological equation of how to beat by using an incorrect, longer method.
Oh, I see.
It's an accommodation. It is the system finding a way to survive when the optimal path is blocked. And this mirrors the profound realization Hesse has about the monastery architecture itself.
About the cracks she traces.
Yes. She looks closely at the jagged cracks in the stone walls she traces every day, and she realizes a structural truth. The building stands because it cracks.
Okay, I need you to explain that, because stone cracking usually means the building is coming down.
Normally, yes. But over 400 years, gravity, shifting soil, and thermal expansion put massive, unyielding stress on those stone walls. If the architecture was perfectly seamless, rigid, and unbending, that stress would build up internally until the entire wall shattered catastrophically.
Oh, wow.
The cracks are actually controlled releases of stress. The building calculates how to stay upright by allowing itself to fracture along lines of weakness.
So it survives the stress by yielding to it. It bends so it doesn't break.
Exactly. Yale's erratic heartbeat, the mineral deposits filtering the water in the pipe, the cracked wall, they all prove the same fundamental thesis.
That systems survive by accommodating failure, not by preventing it entirely.
Yes, rigidity is what causes total collapse.
When you take that out of the book and apply it to real life, it is such a powerful lens.
It really is.
Think about a marriage or a career path. If you build a relationship with zero tolerance for friction, the first major argument could destroy it. But if you accommodate the gaps, if you allow for misunderstandings and messy repairs, the relationship actually becomes more durable.
The cracks are the controlled release valves for the pressure of daily life.
Exactly. And that grand synthesis of how human beings process failure brings us to the postmatter glossary, where these two seemingly unconnected worlds finally collide.
Right, because throughout the entire reading experience, you're wondering how Maren in her high-tech lab and Hessa in her silent monastery actually relate to each other.
Yeah, they feel worlds apart.
But we learn in the final pages that these two novels didn't just accidentally mirror each other's themes. They were generated simultaneously through a very specific mechanism.
Oh, the algorithm.
Yeah, the authors, Max and Claude, used an algorithmic process to create fusion patterns of real-world theorists. They essentially fed the foundational texts of Marshall McLuhan and Catherine Hales and Sherry Turkle into a generative system.
So the book itself is an artifact of mediation.
Precisely.
It is a literal mashup of media theory, cybernetics, and the psychology of technology, processed through an algorithm and manifesting as these two distinct human narratives.
It's a meta-commentary on everything the characters are experiencing. And knowing this, we get to see how both protagonists finally cross their respective gaps.
Right. Hessa, after 13 agonizing months of complete silence and staring at the wall, finally takes a pencil to her empty cream-colored notebook.
She breaks the silence.
She does. She writes exactly 9 sentences. And the climax of her spiritual journey is this unbelievable realization. She writes, "God is the autobiography of a gap."
It is a stunning synthesis of her theology and her physical reality.
It really is.
By tracing that crack every single day, she learned that the void isn't a lack of the divine. The void is the impression left behind by it. Recognizing the empty space and documenting her proximity to it is the story of her faith.
And meanwhile, back in Amsterdam, Maren has a breakthrough of her own.
Yeah, her walls finally come down.
In a way, exactly. She completely abandons the strict, sterile cataloging of her daily inventory. For 11 years, her notebook was just clinical data. Toothbrush, 8 seconds, phone, 4 seconds. No emotion.
Just raw numbers.
Yeah. But after her conversations with Dan, she starts letting the messy, unquantifiable parentheticals take over her writing.
She stops trying to be as cold as her polymer walls. She writes about the exact, complex, totally unmeasurable feeling of holding Dan's hand in the dark.
She deliberately allows her perfect data to become corrupted by human emotion.
It's beautiful.
The contrast between the two women is so satisfying. Maren learns that a perfectly recorded touch means absolutely nothing without the human gap of interpretation, without the messy feelings that distort the data.
While Hessa learns that her spiritual emptiness wasn't a lack of faith, but the exact shape her devotion needed to take.
Yes. So what does this all mean?
Well, both texts are arguing vehemently against our modern obsession with perfection. We are not the seamless 4K fiber optic transmissions of our lives.
We're really not.
No, we are the zero point 0.4 newtons that barely make it across the gap. We are the scars, the pauses, the irregular heartbeats, and the misunderstood text messages.
And Hesse gives this a beautiful name in her notes, right?
Yes, she calls it asymptotic devotion.
Now, an asymptote is a line that gets closer and closer to a curve, but never actually touches it, right?
That's it. Asymptotic devotion is the practice of approaching a limit you will never, ever reach, like total understanding of another person or perfect spiritual clarity, and deciding that the approach itself is sufficient.
Wow.
The gap isn't a problem to be fixed with better technology. It's the space where meaning is actually created.
That concept alone is worth the price of the book. So, to you listening to this deep dive right now, as you go about your week, I want you to actively consider the delaminations in your own life.
Yeah, where are you holding out for 11.7 newtons of flawless, perfect connection from your partner, your friends, or even your own career?
And how can you learn to value the zero point 0.4 newtons? How can you celebrate that degraded, messy, beautiful reality that actually manages to cross the gap and reach you?
When you stop demanding a mirror and start accepting a medium, it really changes how you look at the flaws in your everyday relationships.
It completely lowers the stakes of being human. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to keep transmitting.
Exactly.
And I want to leave you with one final, incredibly provocative thought from the source's postmatter. Throughout this entire physical book, the two novels, The Inventory of Touching and The Unmaking Room, never actually interact on the page.
Right, they share themes, they share metaphors, but the characters never meet.
They are permanently separated by the physical binding of the book itself.
The physical spine of the book creates a border they cannot cross.
The authors state in the glossary that the most important structural feature of the entire project is that physical gap between the two texts.
Because the gap requires a bridge.
And that bridge is you. The reader holding the book is the delamination. Your mind is the signal crossing from Maren's laboratory to Hessa's monastery, carrying the meaning back and forth.
Without the reader's interpretation, it's just ink on two separate stacks of paper. The reader's attention is the 0.4 newtons.
So, as you walk away today, back out into your wildly imperfect world, think about this. What signals are you constantly filtering out in the pursuit of perfection?
A great question.
And what meaning are you actively creating in the empty spaces between the information you consume? Are you just a passive witness to the people around you? Or are you a witness with empathy?